Welcome, everybody, to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for for the Division of Extension and Wisconsin 4-H. And on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, PBS Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight, it's my pleasure to welcome back to Wednesday Night at the Lab, David Gagnon. He's with the Field Day Lab, which is part of the Wisconsin Center for Educational Research. And he'll be talking to us tonight about how only a game can save us and how we can get more robust education and more equitable evaluation and education using games. David, welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
Now I get to ask you the 5 questions. Where were you born?
I was born in Elgin, Illinois, little western suburb of Chicago.
And is that on the same Fox River that flows north through?
I think it might be, as you were saying that, because Elgin's on the Fox, and that's close enough. But
well, it flows south out of Wisconsin into the Illinois River. And where'd you go to high school?
I went to Larkin High School in Elgin.
And where'd you go for your undergrad?
This is going to start getting repetitive, but as you'll see, but I came up here to UW-Madison.
Very good. What'd you study as an undergrad?
I studied computer science.
And did you stay for a master's or PhD or any advanced degrees?
That's exactly what happened. Met a girl, had some kids, got a great job. One thing led to another, and a couple degrees down. And next thing you know, I was one of the lucky few that got to stay in Wisconsin.
Yeah. What were your degrees in?
Curriculum and instruction from here in, really specifying in games for learning.
Very good. So that's what you'll be talking with us about tonight. I really appreciate you coming tonight, coming back to Wednesday Night at the Lab, and looking forward to seeing what you have to say about how only a game can save us.
That's great. So yeah, it's a pretty ambitious title. Hopefully I don't oversell it, but I think that that's the kind of severity I think that will make for a good opening. I'm going to save talking too much about exactly what I do and what Field Day is for a little bit later in the talk, and instead kind of hop right into, I think, the elephant in the room, which is the very popular set of opinions that effectively reduce to the idea that video kids melt kids' brains. So let's just start there. Even in the description of this talk, the word game can mean a lot of things, everything from sports to, you mentioned gambling, it's called gaming. But this kind of phrase, video kids melt kids' brains, is certainly kind of on the lips of most adults, I would say. If you go to Google, I did this as a little experiment right before this, and type in, are video games space, and let it fill out. The kinds of things you'll see are, are they bad for health? Are they, bad for kids? Do they melt your brain? These are the kinds of things that people, think about when they think about games. And there's, really kind of a couple main ones that come up in this. I think, one of the things we hear is like, well, because of video games, kids just don't go outside the way they used to. Or because of video games, kids are more violent than they used to be. Or because of video games, there's concerns over health issues around exercise, a concern over losing face-to-face social time. And I would even go as far to say that I think the biggest, scariest thing about video games is that usually when we're talking about them, what we're really talking about is the result of a very, very large entertainment industry that benefits from increasing engagement, quote unquote. And that puts them in a conflict of interest, I think, for doing things that are healthy or necessarily good for their players. They don't make a dollar if a kid turns off a game. And it's a pretty common thing within the game design world to really try to keep players hooked as deeply and as often as possible. And this is a really, really large industry. Now, in defense of some of these things, especially the latter one, I think you could say the same things, the same concerns that we've had over pretty much every other media. I think there's always been a concern around the effect television has on kids. I mean, even the effect books have on kids or comic books have on kids. So I think that all of those things are in the same family of concern. But I actually would submit that games are a very potent media, and this idea that there would be an industry that would try to keep kids hooked on them, I think, is very dangerous. And I think we're in a time, politically speaking, where we've seen the effects of that similar kind of thing on us in social media and other places, advertisements. But video games, as we'll see, are really powerful media. So let's take a step in one more layer and say, well, when we're talking about games, what are we talking about? When we talk about players, what are we talking about? I would guess that most of the time when you think of games and video games, you're thinking of kids that look like this, younger, male. Limelight did a yearly report that has really become a pretty well cited, pretty well viewed survey. The 2020 report involved about 4,500 18 to 45-year-olds that said that they play games at least once a week. And this was an international survey, US, Europe, Asia. And I think that it might ground us in just a little bit of understanding of like, how are people playing video games and set the stage here. So a couple interesting findings from that. The average time that kids play is about 6 hours and 20 minutes. The gamers in the age of 18 to 45 are ones that would prefer playing video games, where the gamers, people that play once a week that are over 45, 46 and above, would actually say that from media, they would prefer watching movies and television. So in the younger kids, it's really a replacement for a lot of movies and television. The definition of game might be a little surprising, that casual games, so these are things like Candy Crush, or the small games are actually the biggest market of games that are getting played, with mobile phones being the most common platform for playing games. So instead of thinking about a kid in front of an Xbox, when we think about video game play, it's actually a lot more accurate to think about a middle-aged woman playing on her phone. Like this is where the market is at, and this is where it's growing the fastest. About 50%, half of gamers globally, watch each other play online at least weekly. And one of the interesting things is with the younger players, these are in the low 20s and below, watching players play video games is becoming more popular than watching sports teams on television. So watching other people game, is really carving into that market of sports. Issues that were reported in the survey were things like playing too long and losing sleep, missing meals, and reduced social time with friends. And those are the number 1, 2, and 3 self-reported problems. So this starts to paint a little bit of a picture of what and who are playing, what games are being played and who's playing them. But let's turn over to the market part again, just for a second. And one of the things that might surprise you is that video games are a very, very large industry. This video game alone, which was released about a year ago, a little less than a year ago, Call of Duty Black Ops. The newest release is called Cold War. This game brought in $30 billion in the last couple months. So this is a big, big, big industry. If you compare that to Hollywood, the record holder film that has been released since anybody kept track was Avatar. And to date, it's brought in about $3 billion. So we're saying that these games, the big releases of games, are reliably orders of magnitude larger industries than Hollywood. To put a couple other numbers in place, the 2020 estimated revenues for video games were about $180 billion. And that compares to about 100 billion total for Hollywood and about 75 billion for North American sports. So if you kind of put those together, video games are indeed larger than both Hollywood and sports combined. So this is a really, really large entertainment industry. So, okay, that should paint some of the picture of what we're talking about when we're talking about games. So I come in when we start thinking about learning with games. When we describe the entertainment industry around games, that's one thing. Now, learning with games is going to take on it's a subsection for sure. And I want to come at this from a couple directions. One of them is that there's been empirical studies around, let's compare the kind of learning that can happen, the efficacy of learning that can happen with video games versus other modes of instruction. And that's one line. But I think a theoretical line might be a little more interesting. So I actually want to start us with a little bit of a thought experiment. So Frank Jackson, philosopher, created this thought experiment called Mary's Room, and published it among other works in a 1982 book. So just out of curiosity in the chat, have people heard of Mary's Room before as a thought experiment? Is this something that everybody knows? Okay, well then maybe there's something new in here for us. Mary's Room follows this line of thinking. So Mary lives in this funny black and white room and has lived her entire life in this black and white room. And she has a black and white computer. So she has everything around her is black and white. But the funny part is she is an expert in color. She has read everything about human perception of color, about the physics of color, about the way the mind makes meaning about color. She is a bona fide color expert. Now imagine one day, and this is coming from the black and white books that she reads, the black and white articles that she reads, any of the experiments she does in her black and white world. Now imagine one day that her computer malfunctions, and on it instead is a bright red apple, actually red. And the question that comes up is there anything new, anything more truthy, anything more real about seeing a bright red apple with your own eyes versus knowing everything humanly possible there is to know about the notion of red? The question makes sense? It really boils down to the question of, is seeing color fundamentally different than learning about color, right? Is the experience different than all the collective things that we could know about something? So this is, as a non-philosopher, and I'm guessing a lot of you feel the same, you probably have a resounding, well, of course it's different, in your mind right now. Of course there's something about having an experience that is different than hearing about or knowing about or being an expert at something without having that experience yourself. If we take that thought experiment from 1982 and map it over to some educational theory, one of the places that comes up here is Brown, Collins, and Duguid in 1989. And in 1989, they wrote a paper that has really become kind of the bedrock, I would suggest, of the games and learning field, which is called Situated Cognition and the Culture of Learning. And this paper put forth an idea that described knowing and knowledge and the kinds of things that we can know in an experiential way is really what it comes down to. And the basis of this paper was, if you look at practitioners of a given field, like math or science, economics or history, the way they know what they know is very different than the way a student learns about those topics. So to break it down kind of further, they go as far as to say that learning itself is the product of these kind of three main things: the activities that you did to learn it and in the process of learning, the context in which that took place, and any feedback that was given between kind of the instructional system and the learner. So let's make this like really practical. I'm sure you've all seen flight simulators. We know that this is how people train if you're going to pilot an aircraft. And when we ask that question of like, what kind of learning environment is this? situated learning theory gives us a lens. It says, what are the activities they do? What is the context they're doing it in? And what kinds of feedback are given to the learner? So even just in the chat here, think about some things like, what are the activities someone does when they're learning with a simulator like this? Like, what if you were looking over their shoulder and you had to describe the verbs that applied, like, what are they doing, right? Like, what are the actions that they're doing during this learning experience? I'd be curious if anybody has any like thoughts in chat of like, what are the verbs of learning and what they look like here? What does someone do when they're learning in a flight simulator? Dareth, yeah, like scanning the screen. That's right. Like you're actually looking at all these dials in front of you, right? You're looking out at the runway in this case. Yeah, for the last couple, let's be even a little more specific. Like, what verbs are there? These are still pretty abstract. Like, what would you say someone is doing? Okay, yeah, we're getting closer. Feeling, seeing, hearing. Let's even go really practical. These are too abstract. Concentrating problem. Sure, I think problem solving. Yeah, that's true. But like physically, what they're doing, they're literally setting knobs. They're reading dials. They're picking up the earpiece and communicating with ground control. They're moving the stick. They're pushing with their pedals, right? They're physically doing the activities that go along with being, and this leads us into context, within a cockpit. So they're doing the things pilots do. And if you wanted to build kind of a hierarchy of skills, you would talk about reading dials and adjusting throttle, and all of those things would kind of hierarchically go up to the level of like, well, they're landing. That's what they're actually doing. They're landing a plane right now. Or the obvious high level one is they're flying. They're doing the things pilots do. And the context in which they're doing this is as much as money can buy an exact simulation of the exact aircraft they're training on, right? So the fact that the altimeter is where it's at is not accidental. They're actually training on that particular aircraft. Everything about the simulation, again, as much as money can buy, is meant to replicate the actual context of sitting in the cockpit and really flying. And now we get to another funny question or two, and to say, what is the feedback then that this learning environment gives? Well, I don't know what happens when we fast forward a couple minutes from the scene that I've got on screen, but it could be crashing, right? It could be indicators flickering. It could be that a slight turn of the stick immediately makes the whole horizon shift, right? So the feedback, again, is within the language of flying. So the activity, context, and feedback of this learning environment, I would suggest are deeply situated. Let's look at another learning environment and talk about a text. And I've given this talk before and had people say, oh, I actually use this text. This is a real one that's used in flight school. We could ask the same question when we look at a textbook, and we could say, well, what are the activities, the context, and the feedback that this other kind of learning environment, this other learning media gives us? Activity for a book gets a little weird. Again, it's hard to almost be as practical as you have to be. If you were looking over someone's shoulder, you would say that they were doing things like reading, highlighting, maybe taking notes. If you were maybe a little more abstract, you would say maybe they're envisioning in their mind's eye, like, what the scenarios look like. But those activities are really turning pages, reading, note-taking, highlighting. I think those are probably the big ones that you do with a text, if you were just to call it out for what it is. The context of a text is really interesting because they're really mobile, right? You could be at a Barnes and Noble sitting in a leather chair, or you could be at home, or you could be in a classroom. The context is kind of not defined, right? It could be anything that you wanted. Feedback from a text is kind of weird too. Like, what kind of feedback do you have? Well, I think one thing when I'm reading a lot of the time, I'm always predicting like what's going to come in the next paragraph. and you get feedback that way. Or maybe there's questions at the end of it that you could answer and then see if you're correct if there's an answer key. But the kinds of feedback that you get, are in those kinds of modes. So what situated learning theory gets at is, it kind of like Mary's room, it gives us a language to describe how these two learning media are different. And hopefully what everybody is kind of thinking right now is the old adage that book smarts are different than street smarts. It's really what we're talking about. And we're building a vocabulary to understand those different ways someone can know or learn. Okay, so to quickly move through one more example, you could imagine here's a simulator. This is SimMan 3. It's a $100,000 rubber dummy that they use in medical practice, and how working on one of these is very different from a situated standpoint than listening to a lecture about those same medical practices. And I'm poking fun at lectures just a little bit right now with the title of this one. So I would suggest, and I'm kind of betting it all on this one, that with that in mind, video games are an optimal environment for simulating experiences. And when we think about learning being fundamentally experiential, that's pretty interesting. So video games don't do everything. And there are times when raw memorization of facts and figures actually are very educational, very helpful. But there is a certain kind of knowing that I'm making a case for being fundamentally experienced. It comes from doing within a context with feedback. Okay, so we open up the realm to video games now, and hopefully you see where I'm going with this as soon as we start using the word simulating experiences. I'm just gonna kind of roll through some of the video games I found recently that directly link to different learning science literature that are examples of what you would consider like a well-designed learning experience. So this first game I'll mention is called Kerbal Space Program. In this game, you can see those little guys down here. You represent a new race on a distant planet of an up and coming, community of these little characters, and they don't have a space program yet. And your job is to guide them into the development of a space program. And you do this by assembling rockets, slowly but surely trying to send them in space, doing research projects that give you research points so that you can do more R&D, dealing with research grants to fund all of this stuff, and then doing a mix of missions that go from getting up really high in a rocket to getting into orbit to exiting orbit and finding orbit around a different planet or moon, eventually building space stations and bases on other planets. And I bring this game up first because as a learning environment, this highlights the idea of a space to experiment and safely fail. This is one of those times where to actually build a orbital rocket and have it explode is pretty expensive and pretty catastrophic. But in a video game, it's creating a space for you to try and fail and repeat rapidly. And because of that, this is actually one of my favorite physics games by far. Totally different field. Let's switch over to music. This is a scene from Rock Band 2, which is I should say was a very, very popular game. It's a couple years old now. And the main point of Rock Band is the ability to try on new identities. In Rock Band, you don't play yourself. You play this guy and he rocks. So your job as a player is to inhabit this role and to take on the identity of someone who rocks. And the whole game is designed to lead you through this identity. Everything from seeing the roadies set up the shows to having to start in little dive bars before you get bigger gigs, to being able to customize your guitar and clothes. This whole designed experience is really set up to invite you to take on a new identity that's very different than your own identity. Another thing we'll mention about Rock Band is the way that Rock Band functions. The feedback that it gives is domain specific, meaning when you're playing Rock Band, you're constantly listening to the music. So when you hit a note on time, you get to hear that note in light of a song that you like. The primary mode of feedback is the music. So you're assessing music, giving feedback with music. And you can imagine how much better of a game that is than if you would do a pretty common thing that we do in school, which would be, you write an essay on a complex topic and the feedback that's given is a number like 82%. Rock Band is a good example of how games are giving feedback within the domain. And again, a very situated way of giving feedback. Another thing that we can look at commercial video games here, if we look at the Civilization series, we can see how games are particularly well suited to scaffold very complicated systems. In Civilization, any of these games, you're dealing with economies, religion, governmental structures, farming infrastructure, technology, travel infrastructure, business, taxation. And then it comes to all the diplomatic relationships with other nations and negotiating trades of resources and such. These are incredibly complicated systems. And these games do a very nice job at slowly scaffolding our exposure to them. At the very beginning of this game, you are a settler and you have two moves available to you. You can either settle where you're at or you can keep walking. And it goes from that simple choice up into these very, very complicated systems where you're running literally an entire civilization. Another thing that games do for designing experiences, they're fantastic at telling stories. I think anybody that has ever been around any sort of established tradition will know that parables and stories are a tried and true method of education. And video games are in that same vein. I bring up the game Firewatch. It was a game that me and my wife played a few years ago. We don't play many games together, but this one as a storytelling game really stuck out to us. And this is all about a young man who's going through a divorce and takes to the Western Hills to become a fire watchman at a national park, and is working through some of his own conflicts at home through this time in nature. And it's just a fantastic short little story. It's probably a 4-hour game total. And I would suggest it's one of the best examples of a really well-told story in a game. Now, another thing I kind of hinted at with Kerbal Space Program is the idea that games are very good at designing experiences of failure, but then mediating them so they're not catastrophic. It's particularly on the nose right now to mention Plague Inc. This is a game that's been around about 10 years now. And in this game, what you do is nudge the evolutionary pathway of a virus in order to try to kill everybody on the planet. And what I bring this up for is that games are inherently rule systems. So whether you're trying to save everybody on the planet or kill everybody on the planet is just a choice the designer gets to make, to really ask the question, like, what will allow you to understand the rules around viruses and their dangers better. And in this case, the designer said, let's go dark. Let's get into the dark side of this. So obviously failure within games is a lot different than failure in real life. We can try 100 scenarios here. We can lose a bunch of times and we just hit reset, but we get to see the impacts of the simulation. And kind of rewinding a little bit, if we think of that in light of a flight simulator, that's one of the big reasons we use them, is that failure in a game is cheap, it can be rapid, and it can even be fun. Like failure can actually be fun in games. And we know that these things are inherent to well-designed learning experiences. Going even darker, though, I would say games like DEF CON, which simulates global thermal nuclear war, allow us to actually go into places that are so dark that we actually have a really hard time thinking about them and even learning from them. DEF CON is really, if you ever saw the movie War Games, it's built in the style that was played out visually in that film from the mid-80s. And in this, you play a nation like America in war with another nation, let's say China, and try to see what strategies will result in the least amount of death for you. And like the movie, we realize very quickly that there is no way to win. but what an interesting experience for us to have. And my final one I'll mention is a very short little game. It's one that I would actually suggest that everybody checks out. It's probably a 5-minute game total. It's called We Become What We Behold, done by Nikki Case. And this little game gives you the single verb of you're a reporter, what do you take a photo of? And introduces the rule that news that's interesting sells, and very quickly demonstrates the complex and emergent system of effectively violence that results from just those two rules playing out over time. It's just a really, really powerful little piece of a game that helps us, I would suggest, understand parts of our own and current media landscape. So these are all examples from commercial games that I would suggest are prime examples of some of the incredible learning experience design that can be done in video games. And the main point that I'm hoping is coming across right now is really that phrase, video games as designed experiences, and therefore learning as happening through experience. Okay, so that's all like the background. When I'm talking about games, these are the kinds of games I'm talking about. When we're thinking about who's playing games, hopefully we're broadening that definition a little bit. And when we're talking about learning with games, we're talking about a particular kind of learning that we're calling situated learning. Okay, so part 3, where does Field Day Lab come into all of this? In a nutshell, I can say that I had my early career was in instructional design, which meant I was building online learning modules for all kinds of stuff. Post 9/11, I got involved with doing a lot of work related to public health and the kinds of preparedness training that people, hospital workers, police departments, fire departments needed to do in order to prepare for potential disasters. And this was work I did at the university, quite a while ago now. That really quickly led into starting to experiment with simulations. As you can imagine, it's a slippery slope. And once you get into simulations, you start asking the question of, well, what if we had goals for the simulation? And I would suggest once you've done that, once you've got a simulation and you start putting some goals on it, you're probably starting to talk about video games. Field Day Lab is a laboratory that was born out of a pursuit of trying to understand the role video games could play for learning. And as of today, we're a team of a couple dozen folks within the Wisconsin Center for Education Research. And though we are a traditional laboratory at the university, meaning we write grants, perform research, give talks, write papers, we're unique in the sense that we also are a studio. So if you look at the staff, you're going to see artists and animators, storytellers, and software engineers, because we create products that are used by the public. So instead of being kind of what you might think of as a traditional researcher that creates some sort of intervention and you kind of get out your clipboard and you go watch a couple kids, go through your new curriculum, we deploy video games at scale nationally, and then we use them to do our research. So that's probably a good backdrop for that. Let's talk about a couple of the games we've made and why, as an example of where I really think we should be heading. So best ideas to date. First game I'll mention is Joe Wilder and the Capital Case. And I'm going to play a little bit of a video here because I think it actually does a pretty good job kind of painting a picture of what this game is all about and looks like. So in a nutshell, Joe Wilder is a historical inquiry game And it came out of the centennial celebration of the Capitol building, which was just a few years ago. And a major pivot was made early into the project to say, well, let's take the situated stuff to mind. And instead of teaching kids about history, let's give them an experience of what we call doing history. So doing the kinds of things historians do through collecting evidence, arguing a case, developing theories, following up on leads, interviewing people, looking at artifacts, that kind of thing. It was a collaboration with PBS Wisconsin and the Wisconsin Historic Society and Field Day. We produced the game and designed it. And as a game, this is targeted for grade 3 through 5. So these are little kids that are playing this. And in Wisconsin, in 4th grade, they have a year of local history. So they would study Wisconsin history, and this game is very popular to be used during that year. So 4th graders are kind of the bullseye. Again, this game's about professional practices. So it's really, the learning objectives have to do with how do historians know what they know, and how is history done? How is history discovered? But it also deals with the topics of the women's suffrage movement and the development of Earth Day here in Wisconsin. So those are kind of the topics in which you are doing the practices of history. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about this project is, as a collaboration with the Historic Society, we really are scaling out like research practices and getting them into schools. And it has been an incredibly successful project. It's been played over 200,000 times in the last 2 years. And that comes out to about 3.1 million minutes of gameplay that's here. I don't know what that is in hours, but a lot. It's a significant amount of impact that was made through this game. And it's the kind of learning experience that is pretty hard to facilitate. As we've run research around this, when we've asked people, the teachers that we work with, what kinds of learning experiences they're designing that have kids, again, doing history, the actions of history, it's pretty thin. Those are pretty hard to facilitate in a classroom. So this game is providing a gateway into that, and to start talking about, like, well, what does it mean to do history? It also feeds a lot of our research. So as a game now, it is out in the wild. It's getting played right now, I'm sure, by dozens of kids, day in and day out. It's just online. And that's powering all sorts of research agendas that we have in several areas. So one of them in this image here has to do with data-driven design methods. One of the interesting things about video games is that I can make a change to it, and we can deploy that to the website, and it immediately goes into effect. Unlike something like a textbook, where you really can't roll out an edition very quickly. And what we're experimenting with is new methods for us to use the data that we collect through gameplay to improve the game rapidly towards learning objectives. We're also researching the ways that games like this that are practice-based can be integrated with existing curriculum that often isn't practice-based, and are really excited to see these games being used, what we're calling a launch pad, where kids learn some of the high-level practices of historical inquiry through playing the game. That provides some vocabulary to use in class, and hopefully leads to projects where kids can do their own local community history inquiry around their own topics now that they've kind of practiced in a safe spot. Really ripe research happening right now is, Joe Wilder involves a lot of reading, and that at first was looked at as a liability, because obviously the level in which kids read is very disparate. And now we're seeing that because the game is so compelling and kids like reading it, that even struggling readers stick with it and use it as a reading practice text. But by the way they play, the choices they make, the timings of actions, the way that they interview, or the way that they look at evidence, we're developing machine learning driven models to actually assess how good of a reader they are. And in this way, the game is actually becoming a real-time assessment of a skill, in this case, reading. So we're using Joe Wilder as a research platform to understand more about assessment in games, and games as situated assessments, not just learning environments. And then the other one that we're working on right now really has to do with kind of attitudes around learning. And we're very curious about the fact that our protagonist in this game, Joe, is not a model student, is not a goody two-shoes. She's not super excited about getting her homework done on time and being perfectly obedient. She loves her grandpa, and she is motivated by that more than her love of school and history and such. And we're really curious the ways that different ways that we could write will lead to the ways that kids will interact with the game. So effectively the question is, if we have non-conforming characters that are a little snarky and a little funny, does that end up helping the kids that themselves aren't completely bought into the idea that history is the coolest thing in the world and everybody should learn history? Another game I'll mention is Lakeland. Lakeland was released about a year ago. It also has been played a couple 100,000 times at this point. It was a collaboration with Victor Zavala, who is a USDA-funded, he really specializes in simulation at the UW School of Engineering, College of Engineering. His lab's called the Scalable Systems Lab. And one of the things that he's been researching is the complex relationship between farming, excess phosphorus that's produced through manure, and lake quality, and the way that that influences people and economies. And as you can imagine, this is a complex topic. And his research is taking great strides forward into coming up with solutions for this that are even Wisconsin-centric. And we started partnering with him to make this game, which is for grades 7 through 9, because of this notion of broader impacts, that it's the responsibility of researchers that are federally funded to disseminate and share their research findings with the public. And this game was an example of us working with a lab to build a game that was used in schools that really took the results and the topics of his research and scale it out to large public audiences. And there's more to be said on that, but this game's been incredibly effective at that. One of the lines of research that we're doing with this game is really looking at how we can analyze play data in order to create taxonomies of the different kinds of players that play this game and what kind of strategies they use. Often in education research, we see people studying things like the demographics of players. So are they black, white? Are they boys, girls? Are they rich? Are they poor? Often those become the lenses in which we create taxonomies of our different learners. And what this game and its research is trying to do is say, are there problem-solving taxonomies that exist where different kinds of kids approach these systems and these problems in different ways? And can a game not only detect those, but then adjust to those things in real time? Another project I'll show was a project called Discover Ice Cube. This is also a broader impacts related project. It was done with the Ice Cube Neutrino Observatory and the Virtual Environments Lab at WID. This project had a really different kind of learning objective. Out of curiosity, again in the chat, like how many folks know about Ice Cube and like what it is? Like, is this something that this audience is hip to? Everybody knows what Ice Cube is, or is this totally new? I would guess this one would be a mix. So in a quick nutshell, the Ice Cube laboratory is a unique, let's call it telescope of sorts. It's a unique sensor that is a series of sensors that are actually put in a grid in Antarctica, and it does research around detecting neutrinos, which is like kind of fundamental astrophysics, fundamental particle physics. The unfortunate thing about a project like this is, as a foundational research project, it's pretty hard to talk about. Outside of people that attend Wednesday night at the lab and hang around, Saturday science events, you probably most of the population doesn't know about this project. And we really picked up the goal of, can we make a game about this research? And here's the interesting learning goal, that doesn't try to communicate a bunch of math, but instead communicates the kind of passion and curiosity and awe that the scientists that are part of the IceCube Neutrino Observatory have within their ranks. So how do we get the same kind of passion we see all these scientists have? How do we translate the why of all of that to a general public audience? I'll just kind of show a little bit of the footage of what this ended up looking like. It's a VR experience, which means it's completely immersive. In this experience, you basically warp out into space, tracing a neutrino that hit their sensor array in Antarctica that looks like this. And you follow its trajectory out into deep space and back to its source. And while we're there, we kind of get to hint at some of the places neutrinos come from. I bring this one up because unlike a lot of our games that are pretty content and practices centric, this one has to do more about attitudes of science. And I put this frame up as the kind of key frame for this because this is the effect that we saw. Trying to explain what a neutrino is one thing, but like dropping a kid into an immersive environment where they're chasing one into deep space is an entirely different kind of experience. NSF found this experience so compelling that at the end, they used it as a key demo at a number of conferences. At one point, I believe it was even in the kind of NSF headquarters and being demoed. And they funded us to do more work around polar research, again, for broader impacts or disseminating findings of research to the public. The last one I'll mention is the Yard Games. The Yard Games is a collection of small science games aimed at middle school. We've had a number of partners along the way with this, but it's really been an ongoing project. Right now, I think the collection is at 11 different games. They're all playable within about 20 minutes. They're designed to be used for a single class period. And some of the examples of this are like the Wave Combinator, which allows you to play with different waves to learn about constructive and deconstructive interference, and actually kind of put these words of things like wavelength and amplitude into a context and make them kind of meaningful and put some feedback around it. Or the Crystal Cave, which was done with the Material Science and Research Center, MERSEC. I'm sorry, Material Research and Science Center, I've got it wrong. A local UW large research center. And this game is really around trying to create really it's a puzzle game around kind of the basic interactions that take place within crystals and crystalline structures versus glasses. So this collection of games, again, is wildly popular. It's played more than 1 million times a year by kids nationally. And it's a really good example of how small games can fit within a curriculum in a way where teachers can use these to pull out, I kind of think of it as like pulling out of their back pocket a little designed learning experience that, again, uses all the affordances of games. It gets kids trying, failing, having real actions and feedback in order to have experiential learning experiences. Okay, so those are some of the games that we've done. So many others to talk about. We have a Baldwin-funded journalistic practices game. We have a game about underwater shipwreck hunting right now, another Wisconsin Historical Society group or project. We've got a game about penguins research on the South Pole. We've got a large project that I'm the PI on, which is exploring scientific practices in underwater ecologies. Just a whole host of games that are made or in production. Okay, last part. So, do I deliver on how games will save us? the big claim made up front, and I'm going to spend just the last couple minutes, hopefully tying together some of these ideas. So, one of the ways that I think games are a profound savior in this regard is the fact that they can be distributed for near zero costs. Once a game is made, it is usable for at least a decade. We're on the HTML5 standard right now. If everybody in the world got together in Geneva, Switzerland, and came up with the HTML6 international standard, it would take at least a decade for them to make things not compatible. So these games are going to be around a while. And once they're made and they sit on a web server, it is a unmeasurably low cost for serving up one new experience for a kid. This is a map of a couple months of where kids are playing the yard games. And, we're looking at something like 1.5 million plays every year of these games. And we pay about $50 in hosting a year for that. A month for that kind of capacity. Whenever you start talking about free, I would submit something profound happens when you talk about education. Because they're free, this means that kids have a much more equitable access to these high quality materials than many of the other educational approaches and products that are being made and sold and whatnot. I'll come back around to that in a different way, but the fact that it doesn't cost us as a research lab anymore to give this to more kids puts us in a very, very unique spot for, again, rolling out high quality learning experiences. On that same note, we've really come to a very unique place in the last year in that broadband access for individual kids and Chromebooks have become nearly ubiquitous within the United States education system. Now we have the devices and infrastructure installed so that when we do distribute a game, it can be used pretty much by everybody. Now, I know that equitable access to technology is a topic that people dedicate their entire careers to it, but I again would submit that when we look at the alternatives that we've had before this, like access to a desktop computer, the ability for us to access Chromebooks and mobile phones and these kinds of next generation devices is making more and more people have access. I remember when I gave a talk for Wednesday Night at the Lab years ago, I was really into mobile phones and mobile learning. And it's very interesting, the fact that mobile devices became the most ubiquitous technology in the world in something like 2014, and that overtook the FM radio. So the kinds of devices that can play our games are very, very, very common. This idea of assessment and contextualizing assessment is one that is very exciting. Most assessments have deep problems with the fact that they aren't contextual. Assessments often are thought of as individual activities that are done, paper and pencil, and assessment designers have forever struggled with the idea of, are they measuring the things we really want to measure? Video games by nature are assessing in the context of solving problems. In Joe Wilder, we're using evidence that we collect, for example, to argue a case. And every time you pick a piece of evidence to use, that's an assessment. We're gathering data on how and what you're thinking by the way you're interacting with the system. And it's very robust to study assessment in games, even when it comes to things like disobedience. A graduate level game that I was involved in building years ago with John Fotenhauer for the mechanical engineering department, we were able to quickly detect expertise even when students were intentionally making things explode in the game, because they could fail with expertise. So there is a whole line of new contextual assessments that can be done through games that are really going to help us understand where learners are actually at, and hopefully reduce some of the testing bias that exists when kids get good at tests, not necessarily the things that they're being tested about. This is a screenshot from our Aqualab project, and it really shows how games can be used to get at this fundamental issue within education, which is to start focusing on the practices instead of just the facts of different disciplines. Practices of science, like creating models, designing experiments, arguing from evidence. Those are hard to teach in classrooms. Certainly teachers do all kinds of great project-based learning, and there are approaches. Video games are particularly well suited for that. And in this way, we are actually doing the actions of science, in this case, modeling an ecosystem, which are the kinds of things scientists do. So let me end on this thought. I think one of the ways that video games will save us, if we can organize and coordinate just a little bit, would be to connect the huge gap that researchers have with trying to disseminate their findings to the public. This is like a known challenge. And the hundreds of billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars that are assigned to that task through agencies like NSF and NIH, with the known and well-documented need public education has for high quality, free learning media. When I talk about some of these broader impacts projects, we're really putting out a new strategy for having research-driven learning experiences coming right out of a university and right into the public school system for free, that I think has never had an equal. Not only can we see who's playing it, how long they're playing it, what they're learning, but we can do it at a scale that is just unprecedented. When I ran the math before, we figured out that it took something like 0.04 cents per minute of engagement with a kid when we build a game. And you have to pay for that all up front, so it's kind of scary, but you get dividends on it for a decade. Compared to other modes of dissemination, that's orders of magnitude more efficient than a lot of the other things that we do. So I'm very excited about the role video games play within that collective strategy for disseminating research. And one of the key things that I'll be working on, probably with the remainder of my career, is trying to connect the needs researchers have to disseminate their science with the just vast and very pressing need we have within the public school system for free, high quality learning materials. So put all those together, I would suggest games have a particularly unique role in our learning kind of ecology at this point. And it is very exciting to be able to report out some of the things that we're doing and some of the reasons why to this community of Wednesday Night at the Lab. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. That was pretty eye-opening. I'd be happy to take any questions. I think Bia Mum has joined us. You can ask your questions by unmuting and stating them. You can start your video if you'd like. If somebody would like to lead off, that would be great. Otherwise, why don't we go to one of the questions in the chat if we can.
All right, so the first question I'm seeing is from Lawrence, and he says, given that games are difficult to build from scratch, I assume you have a standard set of routines that can be used to easily build a new game and improve them. Is that the case?
Yeah, more and more maybe is the more accurate answer. Through the School of Hard Knocks, we're getting better and better at this. Making a game for learning is a lot more like writing a hit song than it is like following a set of steps. It's an art as well as a science. So at this point, our kind of standard setup is that each of our games takes about 2 years. When we work, when we do that, we have methods for making sure that teachers are involved at every stage of the process. And we've booted up this thing we call a fellowship program that's funded by the Department of Public Instruction. We always make sure that we're working with practitioners within the field as part of that design process. And roughly speaking, we move through 3 phases where we do a lot of conceptualization work, like a lot of whiteboard sketches and document creation for about 6 months. We go into production for about a year where we are testing in schools throughout the state as part of that fellowship program and iterating on the design. And then we go into a post-production phase where we do assessment and dissemination to national audiences following that. So yes and no, there's some buckets here, but every single one is a new adventure.
Would anybody like to speak a question at this time? Okay. I just did. Bea, why don't you read the next one from Sandy, it looks like.
All right. Are you collecting demographic data of your game users for impact of structural racism?
I love this question, Sandy. Thank you for asking it. The answer is In certain cases, yes, but we are excited to do more and more and more of this. Because we get these large national audiences, it really creates a platform for us to more deeply understand who we're serving and how, and by also, extension, who we're not serving as well. A lot of this research has been through playtesting. So when we construct a fellowship, this is again a cohort of usually about 15 teachers across the state that will help us co-design and test the games. We make sure that we have as diverse of representation as we can get. It means urban, rural, affluent, Title I. We look for schools that have low social economic status, that have in most recently, we've really been targeting high levels of Latinx populations. So we get it there during playtesting. The part that I'm excited to just dip a toe in the water of is we're starting to do some basic surveys that launch at the beginning of the games that get at things that are more of a demographic nature. And we're using those to do kind of targeted evaluation. So I would like to say that in the future, we would be able to look at a given design and talk about how it performs within different communities and use that as a way to improve the design for those communities. And we actually have a couple long NSF funded projects that have that as a stated research goal. So we're actively working on that and funded, really to get into trying to understand our players more and how to serve them more.
And David, when you reprise your talk for PBS Wisconsin next week, I'm pretty sure they would be very interested in having that work that you're doing front and center when you give that version of the talk.
Yeah, that's good to know.
Yeah, because that's one of the things that they're focusing on this year is the whole equity issue. And since you have so much experience with that, you're doing it currently. If you could speak to that, revise your talk to pump that stuff up, I think they'd appreciate that.
That's great.
Yeah, it is. It's amazing you're doing that stuff. Does anyone else have a question they'd like to speak?
How do you get information about these games and things like grade levels and topics out to teachers around the country?
Are you saying how do teachers learn about the games or something different? Okay. Yeah, so rule number one I found is that if you build it, they will not come. They just don't. And as a early researcher, I made those mistakes.
I never did.
So here's the key to that is distribution partners. So we work with PBS. We work with a company called BrainPop. We just signed a contract with another company called Legends of Learning. And effectively what we do is we create partners that do distribution for us. And what that means is if we put a game out on Monday morning on BrainPop, something like 3,000 to 5,000 kids will usually play it by Friday. So it's an immediate distribution network that lights up using channels that teachers are already using. And another little hook there is I'm really thrilled for our partnership with PBS Wisconsin and games like Joe Wilder or our upcoming Shipwreck game, because they're even more focused on making sure that we have a focus on public schools in Wisconsin particularly. So those kind of targeted partnerships are just fantastic.
And Bia, do you want to read the next one, please, in the chat?
Yes, so this one is, what do you provide as far as instruction for the teachers? Do you tell them like how to use it, what details to discuss with the students?
Yeah, this is also a really great question. And it's an open line of inquiry right now. So how should you use a game in your class? There isn't an answer for, there isn't like there's a right way. We've taken a reverse approach, which is again, through our fellowship program. If you go out to the website, you can click on teacher fellowships to see more about that. But we recruit teachers that we believe are already really expert teachers, really rock star teachers that are really invested. And instead of telling them what to do, we ask them what they did and what worked. So we really partner with teachers to figure out how that mesh works between the game and the overarching curriculum. And more what's happening is that is resulting in resources for future teachers to use if they don't have as much time as our fellows to prepare lesson plans and the like. There's also a line of research, hopefully will be funded. We've had just a couple pilots so far that are building teacher support tools using our games, where that quality that they have where they can assess knowledge in real time. We're creating interfaces for teachers to be able to see which kids are struggling with certain topics or practices, kids that we're predicting to quit or fall off, kids that we're predicting to become disengaged. And we're trying to use kind of this computational power really to augment what a teacher is able to perceive when they're walking around their classroom in real time. So that's more in the area of using machine learning and data from games in order to support instruction. But again, our research question is, and then what do they do? Because we don't have a prescribed answer for what they should do. We're really looking at our teacher fellows as experts. I kind of skidded around that question, but if you just go out to BrainPop right now and type in Field Day and look at one of our games, there's going to be like a one-page PDF of like some ways to use the game. I'm mostly answering where that thing came from. Yeah.
And Bea, do you want to read Raj's question?
Yeah, so I think Raj is asking, with the video games you develop for kids, can it be extended to a group of kids sharing and exchanging ideas on the same video game, thus promoting collaborative environment?
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, and there's two ways that I think we can approach that. One of them, and I have, this has been my favorite mode, has actually been to build games where different kids are having different experiences based on their interest. So you can play Lakeland a lot of different ways, and it becomes collaborative in that regard, more of like a jigsawing kind of strategy where after play or during play, people can compare strategies and revise their own strategies and talk about them in that way. Another way I think that we're getting into that is some of the support curriculum is really centering on that more and more. The other way is when you actually build multiplayer games. And some of the games, like we've got some games on the carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and water cycles. Those are actual collaborative games where two players play at a time and they try to sabotage each other's cycles. And by doing so, they're kind of, working in the same space. You're trying to get everything to go into runoff and, or that kind of thing. We've done less multiplayer games that are designed as such, and more design of games that are designed to support, lots of kids playing together and being able to talk about it afterwards, as kind of a primary strategy.
And Bea, you want to read Jeff and Julie's question?
Yep. So they ask, you are offering free educational games. How does this balance with the billion-dollar game industry? Both require action feedback, but do you model games after the popular themes?
That is a big question and one that I think about a lot. Instead of talking about like the billions of dollars that are put into, hold on, I'm gonna back off for a second. When we talk about entertainment games, one of the lines of research that exists in my field is people that study the way entertainment games are leveraged by educators in order to do cool and interesting educational practices. So the Kerbal Space Program was not designed to be educational, but it is a well-designed game, and therefore it is educational about something, and that something happens to be very compatible with a physics curriculum, right? That is a whole line. People study the way, people use Minecraft or World of Warcraft or, any number of large successful commercial games, and all kinds of really fantastic learning activities happen around them, those games that weren't intentionally designed to be learning games. I don't do that. I don't get into the entertainment game field and think about how to use them educationally outside of Kerbal, which I love. I keep on mentioning this game. Now, when you zone into the educational game industry, I think the word free becomes very, very, very important. I would submit that the educational system, and especially around education technology, has an almost it really dissatisfies me, the fact that it's a market, and that there are a number of companies that are ed tech companies that are trying to squeeze every last cent out of every single school any way they can. And many of the educational game studios that exist that are selling games are trying to figure out ways to get those underfunded schools, those underfunded teachers, and those underfunded kids half the time to shell out, money to pay for these games. There haven't been many successful business models that have worked there, but the ones that have, and this gets at your popular theme part, are usually ones that provide the least amount of resistance to the existing practices in schools. What does that look like? Well, it looks like crummy games. It looks like games that are really a platformer game like Super Mario Brothers, but instead of catching coins, you're catching math facts, and they can be dropped into the curriculum with little to no integration. They can be hooked into your content management system and your grade report system. And the marketing folks within these studios have taken care of every little reason why people might not be able to quickly sign that contract and get that game rolled out to their school district. I think this leads to a bias in the kinds of games that can easily be bought and sold that are educational for schools. Free is not an unintentional strategy. I think when you put equity first, and you realize that the school system itself structurally has challenges and requires a little bit of innovation, we're not trying to get things that fit within the status quo. We're trying to make games that are adopted by passionate teachers and don't fit within all of the assessment systems, grading systems, learning management systems that are already there and perpetuate a certain form of learning. So free gives us a really interesting different angle than anybody that's charging. I have to deal with the fact that I have NSF reviewers that are trying to find out if we really achieved theoretically our goal to do socially sustaining pedagogy with Latinx kids in rural Wisconsin. And that's would they decide to give me the money or not does this system sell well to a bureaucrat that's going to sign the check to license this game to their school district. So it puts us in free in a place where we're accountable to the goals and the ideas that are learning centric, not the infrastructural ease of integrating our games. But the last part of that would be, and because of that, no, we have to invent a brand new mechanic for every single game we make, because we can't copy platformers and shooters and pinball and existing game structures. We have to come up with ones where kids get to take on the identities and practices of scientists and musicians and historians. And no one's made those games yet. Man, that was long-winded and a little soapboxy, but free has been an uphill battle. But it's one I deeply, deeply believe in if we're going to have a high quality education for all kids.
It also rhymes with equity, as you pointed out.
Yeah. And yeah, this idea of a public utility, yes, I really, really do believe that there are certain public goods like museums and libraries. And I would like to think that research-sponsored high-quality learning games would enter into that area of a public good that would be distributed through public media. Otherwise, the rich kids get the good stuff. And the game's multilingual. I'm sorry, I'm reading ahead. It's a commitment that we do all of our games localized in at least Spanish and English right now, so that all of our recent games are done in at least 2 languages. A couple of them are in German as well, just because Germans emailed us and said, we'll do it for free. But Spanish and English have been the goals right now, just based on population of who speaks languages in Wisconsin.
And Sandy, do you want to read your question in the chat, or do you want Bea to read it? Bea, why don't you go ahead and read Sandy's question?
Okay, Sandy asked, can you measure the digital divide in game learning of those who can't access your games modeled after former UW Trace? And then there are 2 links in there.
I was unaware of Trace, and I'm excited to see it at the University of Maryland. So that is very cool.
Is
So
that
obviously,
Maryland or is that University of Minnesota Duluth?
the website says Maryland.
Great.
No,
Good.
it's Maryland. It was at the University of Wisconsin for many years.
You can tell I watch more hockey than anything else, thinking UMD is University of Minnesota Duluth. So
That is very cool. Can I measure the digital divide? No, we can't. The closest thing I think that we can do right now is we can see where people are playing our games, and we can get metrics for how many kids are playing in affluent regions versus Title I regions of the country. And we can do that using analytic data and get some percentages there. But I wouldn't say that that is measuring the digital divide. That's only giving us an idea of a very complex set of usage data. Because at the end of the day, we still have to say what teachers are pointing to these games and integrating them in their curriculum. And there, there's a lot of factors that are going on there. The thing that I'm excited about is I believe that the digital divide is a shifting and moving target all the time. And this introduction of Chromebooks and widespread broadband access is shifting what that thing means, where more and more people are able to access the kind of stuff that we're making than ever. And that's exciting.
go ahead, Bia.
All right, this one's from Raj. Are the educational games you developed have background classical music, say from Mozart, Bach, etc., which may improve the students' thinking and problem-solving skills and make the environment joyous for the students?
That's great. They don't have Mozart or Bach, but as you will see, we work directly with local Madison artists and come up with soundtracks that I would hope would be joyful and beautiful at every stage. And it's one of the places that it's one of my favorite parts of the project is the kind of musicians we get to work with to create custom and new, music. It really is one of the highlights of doing games, is that it has created a whole network of artists that are now hanging out on campus and coming to our studio that are practicing artists. And it's very cool when we are able to have, like Cyril Peck, for example, is credited on Lost at the Forever Mind as well as Joe Wilder. He composed most of that music on his iPhone until we lent him a MacBook to do his work. You'll commonly see him in checking you out at the Willie Street Co-op when he's not producing music for us. And he's just a wonderfully talented person and came up with a really jazzy little riff and all of the, versions of it, depending on high stress, low stress, that kind of thing. So yeah, we get to work with local artists, but no, I haven't got to work with Mozart or Bach.
Raj, your question reminds me of my dad, who was born in 1925. He and many people in his generation came to know a lot of classical music through the cartoons that came into being in the 30s, 40s. And it's, I don't know if kids today are going to listen to a whole lot of Mozart and Bach and stuff, but it's a very cool idea. I still think John Williams is probably our modern day huge composer for classical music, and kids.
I have to actually confess, it's a pretty uphill sell a lot of the time. What Fred Rogers was able to do in television, where every single, I'm a big Fred Rogers fan and my bias is going to come through here, but every single part of the way that those shows were designed really thought about the experience that they were creating for the audience. And the music in that show is just incredible. The kinds of, I can't think of the guy's name, the jazz musician that laid down the kind of famous Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood track, and you'll notice it modifies for every show. It is really the kind of idol, the character that we constantly look out as a hero, is how do we make things that aren't just functional, but are beautiful? And our creative director, you'll notice, will say, we're artists that make games, not game artists, because a lot of that stuff is pretty cookie cutter. And it really is just a place of joy, I think, for us to say, how do we have beautiful art be part of everything we do and be mindful of the experience that we're trying to create for a kid. And music is a really easy way to call that out. It's very easy to go online, pay $5 for some stock music and shove it in there. And it's something pretty cool when you get to design everything from the ground up.
Dareth, did you want to read your question? Go ahead, Bea, and read Dareth's question for us then.
All right. What is the least capable technology tools that can be used to play your games?
Our target for almost every project is I've got on my shelf some of the oldest Chromebooks that you can buy. We figured that those are pretty much the junkiest machines that you'll find in the wild at this point. So Chromebooks and crummy Android tablets and iPads from 8 years ago. We don't support phones usually. And the reason why is that often it takes quite a bit of design change to get it to work on that small of a screen. And it leads to the equity question again, that if we targeted phones, there'd be a whole bunch of kids that get left out versus Chromebooks seem to be the most universal device right now that we can target.
All right, and another question from the chat. Sandy says, free is not free for teachers with limited teaching curriculum bandwidth. Are you addressing methodologies for teachers with kids preferring not playing online games? Yeah, this is another fantastic question. There's two components to it. The first one is that we have no investment in trying to convert teachers to use games right now. We're not trying to evangelize teachers to use games that don't want to use games. Instead, we're looking for teachers that have already come to a lot of these conclusions on their own and are looking for resources to do it. Now, once you're already in that camp, the first part of that question really applies, which is, where are you going to fit this in? You've got a million requirements on you as a teacher, organizationally through standards, et cetera. How do games fit in? And the high level strategy we have around that is this co-design process. It was with the yard games that we started this idea of, well, let's get a bunch of teachers in the room that teach middle school science. And we brought them all over to the WID, put everybody up in hotels, really, really pumped up the excitement around the fact that they were experts and that we needed their help to build something new, and got them talking about what their needs were in their contexts. And they immediately listed out all the science topics that they couldn't teach, that were really hard to teach. Things like buoyancy, things like magnetic fields, things like triangulating the source of a earthquake, or describing constructive interference in a wave. We got them putting all their needs first. And then we got them talking about what their requirements were. And we heard things like they needed to be playable in a single class period. They needed to be free, no logins, no installs, playable on Chromebooks, integrated with standards. And we just made a list of these things. And then we started shipping them prototypes and said, does that work? And they would give us feedback. And then we say, well, how about this? And for each of the games that we ship, we usually test with no less than 15 schools and 1,000 kids. So by the time the game goes public, it's already been a little battle hardened, and a lot of the rough edges have been worn off so that it does meet the needs of the teachers we're working with. But doing anything innovative is uphill. And the teachers we work with, again, are rock stars. And I think it's something, again, that we need those partnerships with, is that they're helping us figure out how do we do
high quality instruction in public schools, given all the constraints. And it's a collaboration.
And Bea, do you see any other questions coming in on the chat? I think that we covered the ones that I see.
Yeah, I don't think I see any more questions, but I have a question myself. Have you ever thought about trying to get a class or some more promotion within the UW School of Education, so young teachers coming up have like the ground floor of information on the online teaching games?
You know, it's 99% of the struggles in the world are simple coordination, I would suggest. You know, again, I like laid out the big one. If we could just connect the needs for research to communicate with the needs that schools have for good materials, we would change the world. And it's just a matter of trying to connect those two pieces together that is the struggle. So yeah, even though we're at the local school of education, it is a constant, and I would say not yet successful coordination with how we could have a unified front. Outside of the university itself, though, and by the way, the same message goes to research centers too. It's like trying to get that message out that we're here waiting and excited to partner with research centers to do broader impacts work. It's just been so hard to get that message out. It's incredibly slow, even though we know that those are needs. That said, it sure speaks volumes when we're able to go to the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction and show that the Sea Grant Institute and PBS Wisconsin and the Historic Society and our group at Wisconsin Center for Education Research at the university are all coordinating together, you know, to roll out a Wisconsin-centric curriculum around things like women's suffrage. I think that speaks volumes when you do see coordination of large organizations like that. And it is just an absolute thrill to be part of those. When we released Joe Wilder, for example, the kind of launch party that we were able to do and seeing the organizations that were represented gives you a little bit of hope in the fact that that public entities can coordinate when there's a big, exciting shared vision. And we've been lucky enough to be a part of a number of those big coordinations.
Awesome, thank you. And then in the chat, Raj says, top Silicon Valley executives are sending their kids to schools that teach the classical way without modern technologies intruding into their learning process. What are the thoughts on illuminating such as Bill Gates? Yeah, this is another great one. You know, I can tell you all that if you are in my house, we don't have like a television in the main floor. I've got a wood-fired pizza oven in the backyard. We have chickens, and we live like right in downtown Madison, right? My kids were homeschooled for the most of their early career, so I deeply sympathize with that. We have very strict rules around game time in our house, and I have very loose rules on playing with Legos and digging in the dirt and playing with their microscope. So I absolutely sympathize with this 100%. That said, there's an equity thing that's right at the center of this too. There's a whole group of kids that get to go to that Wardorf school and play with magnets that are physical and spread out iron filings on the table and tactily see how those magnetic fields respond. And good on them. I think that's an awesome experience. Most kids won't get to do that in their school. So we're giving them, in that regard, the next best thing, which is a bunch of simulated iron filings that respond like the real ones and are a heck of a lot better than that single illustration in the back of their textbook. That said, even Bill Gates' kids, if they want to learn how to fly a 747, I want to see them get in a simulator before they're my pilot. So I think there's also a generation of kids that maybe aren't the richest and maybe don't have the wealthiest parents and don't get to go to the, that Wardorf school that smells so good because everything's made of wood. And
they're going to learn how to design experiments, create mathematical models, do the kinds of practices that our games teach. And it's going to put them, I think, ahead for the kinds of challenges they're going to run into in the complex world we live in.
And why don't we take Dara's question as the last one, Bia, because it's 8:34 and
Yeah.
All right. How do you see education changing in the future to more games/simulations and less book learning?
I think that's already happened. The traditional textbook that was used when I was a kid, where you had your science book and you kind of walk through it chapter by chapter over the year, that is not common anymore. I think we already live in a world where curriculum are pieced together experiences that a teacher curates, or is at a school, a team of teachers will put together. More and more, what I'm seeing a syllabus look like is all the links in a teacher's browser, of all the resources that they're using. So I think that that's already happening. I think as soon as the internet became ubiquitous, the challenge for education moved from the simple memorization of facts to how do you become technologically literate, where you can find facts as they're needed within the context of problem solving. And now we're getting into a whole other field of multiliteracies and all that stuff. But yeah, I think the overall trend is going to be more towards complex problem solving environments, virtual laboratories, video games, simulated worlds, and hopefully more project-based learning, period. And I think video games are going to be a big part of that.
all right, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I'm going to shut off the YouTube recording now.